Welcome to Author Life Podcast, where myself and guest authors share their stories, offer tips and advice, and share our writing, publishing, and marketing knowledge. I'm your host, Delcherie Gladden. Welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about writing villains and secondary characters. And we have two goals here when we're writing villains. And even though they're the bad guy, you still want your readers to connect with your villain and have some level of love and compassion toward them. And with your secondary characters, we want them to be memorable, even though they're kind of in the periphery of your main characters. They shouldn't just disappear as soon as the reader turns the page. So we're going to talk about some tips and some ideas on how to do that today. Let's start with villains particularly and go over some of the basic traits of villains or your antagonist, your bad guy, however you like to refer to them. So some of those basic traits are that your villain has a negative effect on the other characters. They also provide conflict for the hero. And they mirror or contrast some element of the hero's personality. But also your villain needs to have motives for doing wrong, and those need to be good motives. They can't just be evil for the sake of being evil. There needs to be a reason that they are making these bad choices and having these negative effects in order for them to be fully developed and realistic. I loved this quote from Roger Ebert where he said, talking about film, but it also applies to writing fiction as well. Each film is only as good as its villain. Since the heroes and the gimmicks tend to repeat from film to film, only a great villain can transform a good try into a triumph. So that's what we're going to talk about doing today, is turning that attempt at a bad guy into someone who is truly memorable. Now, if we look at the definition for a villain, this comes from the Random House Dictionary. So this says, a villain is a cruelly malicious person who is involved in or devoted to wickedness and crime, a scoundrel, or a character in a play, novel, or the like, who constitutes an important evil agency in the plot. So keep that one in mind, and I'm going to switch over to another definition. This one comes from Ben Bova. In the real world, there are no villains. No one actually sets out to do evil. Fiction mirrors life. Or more accurately, fiction serves as a lens to focus of what they know in life and bring its realities into sharper, clearer understanding for us. There are no villains cackling and rubbing their hands in glee as they contemplate their evil deeds. There are only people with problems struggling to solve them. So when you compare those two definitions, the Random House definition definitely takes a much flatter approach to defining what a villain is. They're wicked, they're evil, they do things for the sake of being a villain. Very one-dimensional. When you contemplate Ben Bova's explanation, you get a little bit more realistic of a view when he's talking about how fiction and real life need to mirror each other. And that's the approach we're going to talk about more today, and how to make realistic villains that readers can relate to and find some level of compassion with, even at the same time while hoping that they don't succeed. There's a list, according to AMC, of the top 20 villains. And I won't go through all of them. You can look that up just for time's sake. I won't give the whole list. But some of the more interesting ones were ones that I wouldn't have been expecting to see on the list. I mean, you have your regular ones like the Wicked Witch of the West or Hannibal Lecter, Norman Bates, Darth Vader. Those ones top the list there. But some of the ones that maybe you might not have thought of off the top of your head, one of the numbers toward the bottom of the list is the Man in Bambi. He has no name. He's just the character, the Man. But that was on their list of the top 20 villains because of basically how traumatizing that part of the movie was for a lot of kids. It's kind of your first experience with a character you love that dies. And I remember watching Bambi and that happening and just being like, no, his mom's going to come back, right? And she didn't. She died. So some of the other ones that maybe were a little bit less common was the shark in Jaws, where the animal is actually the villain there, even though in a lot of kind of man versus animal type stories, the animal isn't evil. It is most often just following its natural tendencies, but it becomes the antagonistic character in the story. So if you're interested in seeing what the other villains on the top 20 list was, feel free to Google that. But I want to move on to characteristics of a villain. One of the biggest characteristics has to do with power. Most villains are not going to be easily defeated, and they shouldn't be, or that gets really boring. But this power could be physical power, mental power, something more emotionally driven, that sort of thing. But even though they have this power, villains can't be unbeatable. Because again, that's also boring. If your hero basically has no hope of ever accomplishing anything. But the villain is often more experienced or more knowledgeable or more well-trained, that sort of thing. There are also varying types of power, whether that is just a pure physical strength, whether it's some kind of magical or paranormal power, intelligence, or if their power comes from money or influence, or from the amount of resources they possess in comparison to your hero. There usually is an imbalance between the villain and the hero when it comes to power. And a lot of times you'll see that their power is in opposition to the hero, which is not as simple as just saying, the villain has fire power and the hero has water, and those two obviously don't go together. It's got to go a lot deeper than that, and a lot of times it is quite a bit more complex when dealing with that opposition of power. One of the other characteristics of a villain is that they are changeable. And they need to be threatening opposition that stall the hero's progress. And at times, you may even run into the situation where they become a reluctant ally, where the hero and the villain's goals align very temporarily. And for those of you who are supernatural fans like me, and you love to watch Sam and Dean, you'll see this in various episodes where the Winchester boys end up teaming up with Crowley, who in most of the time is their constant antagonistic character in the show. But there are times when their goals line up to take care of a bigger enemy or set something right that's threatening both of them. Then they will team up, even though they are 99% of the time in an antagonistic relationship. When you have that is when achieving their goal as the villain is more important than their individual conflict with the hero. So that can be a good way to kind of break up that back and forth fighting between the two that sometimes can maybe get a little bit tedious if you don't have anything else going on. More characteristics of the villain, we need to take into account their personality. Even a villain's personality should be rounded. That's not just something you're going to work on with the hero. No villain, no bad guy is 100% evil. They're going to have multiple motivations for what they're doing, and a lot of times those motivations conflict with each other. And that is how people are in real life, so that's how even your villain should be as well in the fiction that you're creating. We need to have some depth in our villain's personality as well. Give them a complex history and a lot of varying experiences that have gotten them to the place where they are. It's common to see psychological or emotional damage with our villains. And, you have good reasons for that. not just that they're vague or, yeah, he's all messed up and that's why he's evil. Go a little deeper than that. Really dig into where those damages come from. And just like our heroes, our villains should be shaped by their past life as well. Give them a backstory that's detailed and interesting, but do try to avoid some of those common tropes that readers will kind of just turn their nose up at a lot of the time. So the next characteristic to talk about is the evolution of a villain. Your character arc needs to apply to your villain as well as your hero. Your villain is going to have goals and motives, agendas that change throughout the story. All of that needs to be happening on a progression, just like your hero is going to progress throughout the story. So should your villain. This doesn't mean that your villain has to repent or change their ways or become a better person by the end. They can become worse if that's what you want to go with, but they do need to have some sort of change over the arc of the story. It is important as well that villains learn from their mistakes just like your hero does. For example, if your villain just keeps sending attacks on your hero, one easily beatable person at a time, and never learning from it and just doing the same stupid thing over and over again, your readers are going to get aggravated with that, and that shows a lack of evolution and progression with your villain. Now, the next characteristic is having questionable morality. And in order to have questionable morality, they do actually have to have some morals. Often their sense of morality is going to be atypical to the other characters in the story because it has developed differently than how a normal person would develop their morals in most cases. When it comes to intelligence and morality, villains are often highly intelligent, which can distort their morality, as in some cases where they're looking at the greater good, the ends justify the means, that sort of thing. They can end up doing terrible things that hurt or damage a lot of other people, but in their minds, they are doing the right thing. Often they will have their own moral code as well. For anybody who saw the movie Black Mass when it came out, it had the story of Whitey Bulger and kind of his way of running this crime syndicate in his town, and how, they didn't sell drugs to kids, and they had these certain things that he didn't allow the people under him to do. He developed that moral code on his own, but most of the people outside of his group still would have had major problems with his moral code, even still. Villains often believe the rightness of their own cause, and that rightness trumps anybody else's sense of morality. And they also kind of view it as they are above other people's morality, and their morality is more important, therefore the world's morality does not apply to them. Now, when we talk about determination and villains, good villains shouldn't give up easily. They are often going to be very single-minded and obsessed with reaching their goal. They do have moments outside of this where you get to see other aspects of their character and other motivations and interests, which is good, because truly obsessed characters that are always 100% focused, 100% on task, that does get tiresome for the reader. So do allow your villain to step outside of that focused obsession and have other experiences during the story as well. You do want them to be driven, where they see it as they can only complete their goal by winning, in a sense. Meaning of self is often tied to meeting that goal and that sense of winning. They really tie those two together, and that brings into their character this refusal to fail. And so they keep trying and possess that really driven quality. Now, moving on from some of the characteristics of villains, it's important to talk about using show versus tell when we're talking about our villains. When we have just kind of that stereotypical throne-sitting villain, someone who rules tyrannically but never takes direct action himself or herself. And the problem with this is that readers never actually see your villain being evil. He's just kind of giving the commands and sending people out. So the reader has to depend on the author telling them that this villain is really awful and terrible, because they don't actually get to see any of that. And a good example of that is Sauron in Lord of the Rings. He's this, all-powerful being that everybody else fears, but you as the reader or as the viewer of the movies, you're seeing, the orcs and the white orc and the Nine Kings. They're the ones out doing all the dirty work, and they come off scarier in a lot of cases than Sauron does, because he's just kind of this amorphous eye thing up in the tower, and we don't really get to see any action coming from him. So, sometimes that works, and if that's the path that you feel you need to go, you can definitely do things to help with that. But with most cases, it is better to try to show that evilness and that villainous characteristics than just telling your reader about it. So that's when we kind of had the hands dirty villain, where that villain is taking direct action against the characters that the reader cares about. It creates more of an emotional investment. So consider those of you who have read or watched the Harry Potter books or movies, when you get to the one where you have Dolores Umbridge, and she's just this horrible teacher who basically is very abusive to the students in the way she hands out her punishment. And you're either, reading or watching, and Harry is having to use this magic pen that as he writes his sentences, it's carving the words out on the back of his hand. And, especially watching it, you're like really cringing and you really hate Dolores Umbridge. And it creates a very good emotional connection between both your hero and the villain. And that's going to have a more lasting impact than the throne-sitting villain that's kind of evil in a vague way. It's important not to try to take the easy way out when it comes to your villains, because readers will see through that. Motives need to be believable and realistic, but they have to be true motives as well. And keep in mind that mental illness is not a villainous motive. That is going to be a different type of problem and struggle to deal with, and that really shouldn't be your main motivation for your villainous character. That may come into play, but mental illness itself is not evil or villainous. So, try to make sure that you're aware of that distinction. Motives also need to make sense. If the villain's goal has to be met simply because it literally has to be met in the story, that is an author created motive. And it doesn't make sense to the reader, and they're going to stop and be like, what? Why would they do that? And I remember having that exact thought the first time I watched Hocus Pocus. And that's one of our favorite Halloween movies. We like to watch it with our kids. But you have that moment toward the end of the movie where the little girl escapes. And they need to have a child. They suck the life out of them to regain their youth and beauty and all that. And the little girl escapes, but they've got all of these dozens of children walking up to the witch's house that are all have been basically hypnotized. And the evil witch, Bette Midler, is playing her. She's like, we have to go get that one girl. And the other sister is like, but we have all these other children coming. She's like, no, I have to have that one girl. She escaped. And of course, they fly off to get this one girl that they want to have, and things go badly for them, and they burn up in the dawn. And I remember even thinking that as a kid, being like, that makes no sense. There's no reason that they wouldn't have just gotten one of the hypnotized kids. sucked the life out of them, and then gone and found the little girl that escaped. So try to make sure that your motives that you're giving your villain aren't superfluous, and that when your reader evaluates the validness of those motives, that they're going to be like, yeah, that makes sense. I agree with that. Also try to consider the concept of expected evil. Having characters demonstrate a few stereotypically evil characteristics or acts with no substantive backing falls pretty flat. And that's kind of that evil for evil's sake idea. True evil and true just awful things that happen and terrible decisions that people make and hurt that we cause each other, it's very complicated and complex. And it can very rarely just saying, well, he did it because of this. Or, she did this awful thing because of this one thing. It's going to have a lot more to it than that. And with your characters, they need to have just as complex motive and reasoning as people in real life. Now, consider 5 questions that you need to ask about your villain when you're trying to decide whether you've built them up to be complex and have depth and have good motivations. Ask yourself, what is the villain's motivation to reach their goal? Hopefully they have some kind of motivation that you've built into their story. Question 2, how will they determine success? What is their end goal and what does that mean to them? Question 3, what can the villain not lose? Because even our villain needs to be worried about failing. If they don't ever think they'll fail, if there's nothing that they could lose that would affect them, that creates a much flatter villain. Question 4, why does the villain fight the hero? Do you have a good reason for the conflict between them? Just being the hero and the villain is not good enough. There needs to be some deeper reasoning on why these characters are fighting against each other. And number 5, what will the world be like if the villain does win? What would be the consequences of that? Does your hero understand that? Does your villain understand that as well? So this was another good quote that I wanted to share from James N. Blau, who's a journalist. It says, one doesn't have to operate with great malice to do great harm. The absence of empathy and understanding are sufficient. And I think that's a very concise statement to capture a lot of complexity in the world. So you want to strive to make your villains human, humans who have been twisted and warped into doing and believing terrible things. So start with a realistic person, go from there, bend and twist as needed, turn them into a villain, but they need to start at a place of reality. Now, let's move on to talking about secondary characters and how to make them stand out, even though they are going to remain in the shadows of the main character for the most part. Now, there is a difference between secondary and tertiary characters. Secondary characters do impact the storyline and the main characters. They are going to be a recurring person who shows up throughout the book. And they're going to have a moderate amount of intimacy with the writer or with the reader and with the main characters. Now, a tertiary character is going to appear once, maybe a couple of times. They're going to have a very limited purpose, usually to provide some sort of information at a particular time. And they're going to have very low intimacy. We want our secondary characters to have impact with our readers and on the story. Less important doesn't mean less real. Secondary characters will usually still have an arc of some kind, though it is going to be less complex than the main character's arc. They should have their own stories and their own personalities. And they have a purpose that progresses the storyline or aids the main character or the villain. They need to have reasons for helping, and those reasons must be genuine or fit the character's personality. The role of secondary characters shouldn't only be in relation to the main character or the villain. Falling into stereotypes is easy. such as you have your character that provides comic relief, or is the love interest, or is just that lovable rogue that pops up now and again, or is the wise old mentor. If that is their only purpose in the story, it's time to dig a little bit deeper. Their thoughts, actions, and choices need to be made based on their own characteristics and not simply based on the main character or villain's needs. You want to develop motivations based on their own backstory. These characters should exist prior to meeting your main character or villain. So take a little bit of time and build up just a basic backstory for these characters to help you understand them better and communicate that to your readers. Now, let's alter the focus a little bit when we're talking about secondary characters, because not everything has to be about the main characters. Without detracting from the main storyline, you want to turn the focus to the secondary characters every so often so you can develop their lives and their backstories. Who do they love or hate? What do they fear? What are their thoughts about the journey that they're going on along with these main characters? What personal issues may impact that journey and impact specifically the other main characters? Give them a life away from the main character's story. Let's talk a little bit more about mirrors. We don't want to limit the secondary characters to acting solely as a mirror. And this is what I mean in this is the sense that the secondary characters are reflections of the main character that allow him or her to check the state of their own being or learn lessons from their mistakes. If they do have similar traits, we want to use those in a more realistic way. And that would be talking about the level of similarity causing some dislike between the two characters. Such as the MC thinks he knows the character and can expect a certain reaction, but that secondary character fails to give that exact reaction, and we develop some conflict there. We want to use secondary character traits to provide chances for the main character to mess up or make mistakes. Now, positioning secondary characters can be difficult sometimes. It is okay for a secondary character to start or end up in a better position than your main character. If they're better suited or better qualified to rule or win, realistically, why wouldn't they? So if that's not how you want things to end, we may need to make some adjustments there, but that can be the optimum ending, to have a secondary character end up or begin in a better position. The hero doesn't always have to be the hero, and the villain doesn't always have to be the villain. You may have a secondary character that takes up that role for a limited time in order to progress the story and rely on traits that are more suited to that secondary character than to one of your main characters. You can also allow secondary characters to act on their strengths as well as their weaknesses. They're going to have faults and strong areas as well, and they need to use those throughout their story. Now, don't forget to keep it mysterious. Just like with your main characters, you're going to have a lot of details, and those slowly get revealed throughout the story. With your secondary characters, you're going to do a little less of that. You're not going to divulge all the details. Keep the really pertinent details there on the surface that the readers need to know about, but some of the other details you want to keep to a minimum with your secondary characters. Leave room for questions and wonder. You never know, that may end up providing story opportunities for later, but you don't want to overwhelm your reader with your secondary characters' stories when that's not the main focus of the plot and the story you're working on at that time. You want to give enough detail that they act as a window to another culture, place, time, etc., whatever it is that's related to. It reminds the reader that there's always more to the story, but you don't necessarily need to go into all the details of those secondary character stories. So just with a final thought to wrap up this discussion on villains and secondary characters, there is so much more to a great story than a lovable hero. Readers need to connect emotionally to every character on some level to keep them interested and involved in the story. Love or hate or something in between, reaction is what you're going for. Apathy toward characters breeds disinterest. And disinterested readers put books down and look elsewhere for their entertainment. And sometimes that is a permanent decision, and you may not get those readers to come back even for future projects. So, hopefully these tips have been helpful in giving you some ideas on how to dig a little deeper and make a more realistic villain, as well as how to make your secondary characters stand out without overtaking your hero's story. Thank you again for listening. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to stop by the blog or the podcast feed and leave your comments and questions there. Thanks again for listening. Thanks again for listening to Author Life Podcast. For more information on the podcast or guest authors, check out the links in the show description. If there's a topic you'd like to learn more about, find me online and send me suggestions anytime.